Okay, sorry. All right, so welcome everybody to the meeting this evening. My name is Grace. I'm involved in the Radical Housing Network. I'm going to chair this meeting. We're hoping we have a number of speakers to lead off the discussion, and hopefully we'll have time for people to speak, ask questions, make their own comments. But I'd really encourage people during the meeting to, if you hear something that you're confused by, you don't agree with, you want to respond to, please use the chat box, because it's a really good way of getting the discussion going, and it gives something for the speakers to feed back to. And we will then, at the end of the speakers, we'll try and bring in people who've commented in the chat box so you can make your comments to the group. So I say I'm in the Radical Housing Network, and the idea of this workshop came about because we were starting to develop a charter, which we were hoping to work with other housing groups to have a charter of demands to solve the housing crisis in response to the government's plans to introduce this white paper on planning, which is essentially the opposite of what we need to solve the housing crisis. And as part of a discussion about those demands, what kind of demands we could be putting forward, we realised there is quite a debate to be had and a discussion and really some education for ourselves about the intersection between demands that deal with the housing crisis and demands to deal with the environmental, the ecological, the climate crisis, which is sort of shaping all of our lives at the moment. I think it's indisputable that the climate crisis is here on our doorstep already. But the scientific consensus is that we have literally less than a decade to make the sort of radical, far-reaching changes that can stop kind of a runaway climate crisis that could literally make huge swathes of the world unlivable. I mean, that's the stakes we're dealing with. So in a certain sense, the demands that we put forward around housing, there's a huge it's not something we can put to one side while we sort out housing. Both of these issues are sort of pressing down on us as urgent issues to deal with right now. So I'm really pleased that apart from some wonderful experts from within the Radical Housing Network, we've had a response from a number of groups who've come along tonight to take part in this discussion with us. And I hope it'll be useful, educational, thought-provoking, and hopefully will lead to some ideas for how to take this movement forward. So the first person I'm going to start with is Paul Watt, who's been working with the Radical Housing Network for a long time. He's a housing campaigner, has written a number of important books on gentrification, on regeneration, on council housing. So Paul, do you want to, shall I unmute? Are you unmuted? Okay, Paul, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Grace. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about two things, really. I'm going to talk about housing supply. I'm going to talk about housing need, and then I'm going to talk about housing, empty homes, really, and trying to think about the relationship between those two. Okay, so I'm sure that probably everybody on this call is familiar with this charts like this, which essentially go back to, it shows you the scale of house building then, right by the way back from 2019 up to 1919, right the way up to 2013. And, it's a famous chart that's often used, and it clearly shows you then the massive scaling back of council house building in this country. And essentially then you can see there that, despite what free market economists say, the private sector has not stepped up since the collapse of public house building, nor has housing associations. So this is the scale of the decline in the amount of social housing that's being produced. And I would argue in many ways then it's precisely this which lies at the heart of the housing crisis that we see in London, and obviously the epicenter of that in London. And this chart, in many ways, as well, is an excellent way of thinking about, people often say, well, what's neoliberalism? Well, really, this is neoliberalism in action. Really, you can see then that essentially the state is withdrawing from the provision of a particular service, in this case then housing. Of course that's only part of the story, of course, because not only has not enough social housing been built for the last 40 years, but also it's been sold off. And again, I'm sure these are very familiar issues. It's been sold off primarily through the right to buy, but also other sales schemes. What you have here, this data then goes from 1997 to 2020, and roughly over 1 million, nearly 1,100,000 homes have been either sold, or social homes have been either sold or demolished. Demolitions account for actually 20% of that total over the time. So numerically, the major reason for the shrinkage of social housing in this sense is the right to buy and sales. But of course, the right to buy doesn't itself, the sales doesn't immediately have a negative environmental impact, whereas obviously demolitions do. And demolitions then, clearly should be absolutely rejected as a way of, particularly in terms of regenerating estates, basically. So I just want to move on then to, what about the scale of need then? Well, the typical scale of need then in terms of social housing is often used on housing waiting lists. And you can see there, the data then shows you in 2020, 1,100,000 homes then were on local authority waiting lists. The National Housing Federation has done a recent report which says that they reckon that that's actually an underestimate by about 500,000. So you're talking then roughly, there needs to be, the current population in England there's a deficit of over 1,600,000 social rental homes. Now, the point then is that I've put the data then on empty homes. And certainly what you have is the total number of vacant dwellings there, 648,000, but then what's called the long-term vacant dwellings is about 225,000. And obviously there are issues with the data and we can discuss that. But the main point of this is, I'm trying to emphasize is that, I'm 100% behind the Empty Homes campaign. I think it's very, very important. Unfortunately, I don't think that just filling empty homes is going to solve the social housing deficit, basically. My argument would be that there's going to be some necessity for some new building or possibly acquisition because the scale of because of the mismatch basically between the scale of need and the number of empty properties. And there are also kind of interesting regional differences there. You can see then, despite London as often being, London is often highlighted in terms of empty homes, and obviously that is certainly true in the relationship to the, the luxury apartment blocks that are left empty. The lights are on, but nobody's home. That sort of phenomena. But nevertheless, actually, it's the northeast which has got the highest proportion of empty homes. And again, the empty homes reports show this, that yes, there's some sort of London phenomena, but in many ways some of the areas with the highest degrees then of empty homes are actually in the north. But then when you factor in then the issues then around, you're putting these together, you're putting then the regional differences and the empty homes together, and you can clearly see there that in London then you've got, again, you've got something like 24,000 long-term empty homes, but you've got 250,000 people then are on the housing waiting list. So clearly there's a huge mismatch. And certainly, as I said, I think that, all the kind of like the policy initiatives to try and reduce the number of empty homes, I think is very positive. However, again, I just don't think that that's going to deal with the scale of the lack of social housing in London, but also across the country as a whole. The red. Sorry, they just finished. The red, the orange bar there, that shows you the numbers of temporary housing. And you can start to measure then acute housing needs. And currently then there are something like 58,000 households in London living in temporary accommodation. And again, that's over double then the amount of empty homes. Okay.
Thank you, Paul. That was really good. I think that puts in a nutshell sort of the challenge that's facing us is people need homes, but building houses is inherently damaging to the environment, and that's the bottom line of the kind of contradiction that we're trying to unravel here. So, but I'm going to bring in some of the other speakers, and hopefully we're going to hear about other solutions. Sorry, Sarah Edmonds is from the Architects Climate Action Network. Thank you so much, Sarah, for coming as well. I'm going to give her also a really unfair 5 or 6 minutes to make the case for how we can solve the housing crisis in a way that solves the climate emergency as well.
Thanks, Grace. I mean, I hope to give some food for thought. I don't know if I have the answer for solving the housing crisis in a climate emergency, but I can just give you our perspective, a few thoughts to think about. So my name is Sarah Edmonds and I'm the thematic group coordinator at the Architects Climate Action Network. ACAN is a network of individuals within architecture and related built environment professions taking action to address the twin crises of the climate and ecological breakdown. Our manifesto has 3 overarching aims: decarbonise now, ecological regeneration, and cultural transformation. So we try to push for more ambitious regulation, which we urgently need. We recognise that more is needed than reaching net zero. We must seek to engage in restorative practices and simply not do less bad. We need to encourage more collaborative working environment and fundamentally a more informed industry, as well as engaging with the wider public and political stakeholders. But we also hope to inspire workplace activism, creating change from within our everyday jobs. So our structure is such that we have 9 thematic groups listed here, from circular economy, existing buildings, natural materials. And we also have a number of working groups, including events and media and outreach. And we've listed some of the types of action that we take here as well. Grace asked me to join you today to discuss the kind of huge question: how do we solve the housing crisis in a climate emergency? This is not an easy question to answer. So let's look at the big picture of the climate emergency. The Paris Agreement's long-term goal is to keep the rise of global temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels to avoid irreversible catastrophic impacts. Research shows that we may have already locked in 1.5 degrees of warming, even if we magically reduced our carbon footprint to 0 today. According to the Climate and Migration Coalition, last year, 24 million people were displaced by weather-related disasters like floods, hurricanes, and fires. And it's estimated that 1 billion people worldwide will live in and therefore be forced to leave uninhabitable places at 2 degrees of warming. Now let's look at the local picture. I mean, the climate crisis is a real-life occurrence for many across the UK today. Pictures here showing extreme weather events that have devastated parts of the country. But we also have fuel poverty and continued overheating risks to deal with. Because homes in the UK are responsible for 20% of total UK carbon equivalent emissions, mainly through heat loss of a poorly performing existing housing stock. So what's the role of the construction industry in all of this? This chart here shows global CO2 emissions by sector, and that the construction industry accounts for around 40% of that. Furthermore, embodied carbon that represents the greenhouse gas emissions caused by the construction of buildings, it accounts for around 70% of a building's total emissions and is entirely unregulated. So if you don't know about it and you don't measure it, how can you do anything about it? Sorry, I didn't mean to have that one in there. Not enough regulation exists to prevent. Our construction processes are carbon intensive, wasteful, and destructive. Not enough regulation exists to prevent excessive embodied carbon being used in the construction of new buildings, nor in the energy that's used to heat and run them. We must move towards a circular economy model where we value our existing building stock more, but ultimately where we value the finite resources of the planet and do more to protect it. It is, after all, our ultimate home. ACAN are trying to bring about systemic change by asking for regulation of embodied carbon and by pushing for a national retrofit strategy, amongst other things. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing, you can do any of the following things here, or just get in touch and we can let you know a little bit more about the active campaigns that we have going on. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That was really a really useful overview of the whole issue in terms of the environment. And you're obviously going to stay in the meeting, so if people have specific questions for you on architecture ideas and refurbishment, we can come back to those. Brilliant, thank you. Rex, can I call you to speak next? Rex McKenzie is an economist and focuses on looking at the impact of wealth inequalities in housing. So Rex, do you want to say what you feel is the solution to the housing crisis in the context of a climate emergency?
I don't, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. I don't know that I can answer the big questions that you're asking, but I think I can contribute something to a smaller part of the overall picture. I do research in wealth, what I call wealth chains, which is the use of tax havens to buy houses in British cities. So far, we've looked at Kensington and Chelsea, and we've also looked at Liverpool and the Merseyside area. So we've finished these particular studies. So it's interesting what we found in Kensington and Chelsea, which was huge corporate money coming in for massive regeneration projects. Projects that were not aligned with the community's interests, but we were able to untangle money coming from Luxembourg, coming from the British Virgin Islands, coming from the Cayman, and just coming in and buying up space. Now, what we found in Merseyside, what we found in Merseyside was different. What we found in, for instance, the key offshore actor in Kensington and Chelsea was in fact Luxembourg. Not that they were the biggest, but they were the key in corporate buying of property in Kensington and Chelsea. When we moved to Liverpool, we found something completely different. We found something that pointed to smaller flows, but flows into private residences, which were buy to let residents, aimed primarily at students, because Liverpool is a big student city, 70,000 students. And then there was we managed to do this kind of breakout of use of land. So we found, first of all, Liverpool City itself, the use of land there was for students buy to let. Then we started looking at other areas on Merseyside, and we found, for instance, a use of land devoted to senior citizen housing. Then in St. Helens, we found what I found to be extremely interesting: the extraction of ground rent from properties in St. Helens by the buyers. So we're left in this position. We did it deliberately. We chose the richest borough in the world, or in England, UK, but we also chose one of the more deprived boroughs in the world, in UK, and we wanted to put them together to see what we could see. So right now we are retracing our steps. We're going back to London, but we're doing an all London study, right, rather than a specific study. We're finding that we're mostly concerned with 3 boroughs: Kensington and Chelsea, Westminster, mostly Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster. There's like 54% of the offshore properties are in this area. But we're going to contrast that with Southwark and Croydon, because again, we want to see what we can see. We're acting on hunches. The most important point I can tell you from my research, from our research, is data is really sketchy. If you want to know who owns what in England, it's a difficult task. It's shrouded in opacity, just like the offshore, and you don't know what's what. Before you stop me, because I think I might be running out of time, let me just say this. Paul presented something that I'm going to support him on in this way. We don't see the housing problem as a supply side problem. We don't see that. We think there are other issues which need to be looked at. And mostly what we've found is that the removal of social welfare through austerity is the major contribution to what we see as homelessness, etc., in the capital. I don't want to go on about that too much, but it was certainly in support of Paul. In terms of climate change, we are looking at something called resilient housing. Those slides, those very fancy slides that Sarah showed, with the flooding, we're looking at something called resilient housing as a way to actually combat that. We're not very far into it, but it seems something worthy to pursue. I'll stop there because I am sure I'm on my 5.
No, thank you, Rex. Sorry, I wanted to let you finish your train of thought, but I think I mean, obviously we'd love to hear from all of you for a lot longer, because these are obviously just really like incredibly complex issues. But I think the main point there, we can't just look at how many houses, we have to say who owns them and how do we get control of them and get them in the people who need them. So anyway, I'm gonna, there's some interesting discussions and debate going on in the chat, which is great. So I'll advise the speakers to have a look at those as well and start thinking about responding to some of the questions people are raising around that question of who's gonna control the bedrooms that the wealthy are hoarding. So the next person that's going to put their spoke in is Sabine Mary, and Sabine, I can't see where you are to unmute you. She is a campaigner on Central Hill Estate, trying to stop that council estate from being demolished, and has done a lot of work looking at the impact of the new building and the demolition on the biodiversity, and that's another element of the environmental impact of construction. So Sabine, do you want to have you unmuted yourself?
Yes.
Great.
So when we talk about biodiversity, it's quite a new subject that's been introduced into like environmentalism and housing. And when we think about biodiversity, we've often campaigned for like rainforests, we've different climates, marine life, and we don't tend to look at like the biodiversity in the UK, which is very much under threat. And as habitats dwindle. And so then when you think about the UK, you think, okay, well, countryside, obviously these big swathes of like green land, but obviously because of monoculture and pesticides and hedges actually diminishing, there's still a lot of struggling going on in the countryside. So obviously there's still a lot of biodiversity quantity-wise out in the countryside, but a lot of it depends on the parks and the green spaces that we actually have in the cities, the kind of forgotten spaces, the gardens that maybe are not overly kept, and obviously the park spaces that we have if they're not given too much pesticide. So how does that tie in with housing? Well, a lot of developers now are looking for pockets of land, and they will find this kind of like disused area or this overgrown green space, and they'll kind of plonk their building onto it. And there's now a requirement to provide biodiversity assessments, and there's got to be a gain or there's got to be a loss. But very much the data is distorted. It's just trees are not included in the calculations. The borders are shifting. They're not the same on the before and after plans. The same lawn is given more after than before. But also the solutions that they're providing are things like a green roof on the top of a tall building. Well, that doesn't encourage biodiversity because things can't get up there. So whatever habitat there is up there won't be very diverse. And these kind of things, they're also offering solutions that you could put on existing properties like bat boxes, bird boxes. And what's being favoured now is what's called a green corridor. So even if you do leave some of the trees at the front, as is happening with Central Hill, you leave some trees at the front, but then you put this massive building which actually cuts it from the rest. So therefore there's no continuity for the birds and the species. And just to look, obviously in Britain we've got a quarter of our mammals are under threat. We know that the bees are you know, kind of on their last hope for us now. So that's how it ties in to the actual developers. And then, as was mentioned by ACAN, is the sheer amount of resources that are being used in building, like 10% of carbon emissions. Cement produces 10% of carbon. I have it here somewhere. 10% of carbon emissions. Steel 25%. Paper, plastic, aluminium. They all need to be mined, they all need to be transformed into something, and they all need to be brought somewhere. And if you include demolition, you're also knocking down sometimes a building that could stand for a lot longer, and what you knock down you're just turning into like foundations for the next building. So some of the waste may be reused, but it's a much inferior way of using it. Just another data to put out there is that 60% of the 200 million tons of waste that we produce, the UK, so this is weight of waste, 60% of it comes from construction. And like I say, some of it is recycled back into the industry, but isn't used in the same way. And that's not to mention the massive amounts of carbon that are released in this very, very wasteful ways of transportation, of removal, of digging. So the last point I wanted to make is, so if you have to choose, which I think is a very important point, if you have to choose between housing a family or cutting down a tree, of course you house the family. It's not so environmental that you don't want people to find a house to live. But if at the moment you have to demolish an existing social housing to then build two back, but this is so expensive, you have to build another one to afford it, or maybe three. So you're building 4 houses to literally replace the social housing that was there and possibly produce another one with far more expensive, you know, insecure tenures, far more expensive. People are being locked into fuel poverty. So it's an extreme, the whole system that we have is very, very consumerist, and we know that it's all money led developers behind that. But we have to take a step back and look at, okay, if there has to, this tree has to come down, it has to come down, but maybe it doesn't have to. And maybe construction can be built around the natural environment, or we could just reconfigure what we already have to, you know, build on top, build alongside, or not build, you know, like reconfigure, which we've mentioned before. Other speakers have mentioned, but I guess it's very much down to what is being built, which everyone is saying is like, even after all of this investment of energy, of environmental cost that's going into something, at the end of it, what do you have? You have 3 private homes, a replacement of the social home that was still there, and possibly another one. And so, you know, that's not going to alleviate anything, and it's just going to perpetuate itself. So it isn't even fulfilling what it's aiming, what it says it's doing, which is to alleviate the housing crisis. So that's my point about biodiversity. I don't know if there's any other points.
No, thank you, Sabine, and definitely you can come back in and respond if other people ask questions on that. Obviously you are very knowledgeable, got all the statistics there to hand, which is brilliant. But it's also the whole biodiversity thing on your estate is such, it's also a reminder of how much bullshit the developers talk about with green roofs, etc., and how much greenwashing there is in the construction industry when they're talking about these net zero carbon buildings, and you look into it and it's meaningless. But anyway, thank you for reminding us that, Sabine. The next person I want to bring in is Chris Bailey from Action on Empty Homes. So I think you're going to be sort of giving probably a direct response to Paul, but also of taking up some of the issues that have been raised already by other people. Sorry,
hello.
Chris. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I am going to respond to some of the things speakers have said. I mean, in actual fact, the data I have used is subsequent to Paul's data. It's the data for 2020, so it will show some differences because there was a big increase in empty homes in the 2020 data. It increased by almost 20%, 19%. But some of that will be pandemic related, but it did reveal some interesting characteristics in the data. So you had kind of oddities like in Southwark, where long-term empty homes rose 60%, so-called second homes rose 600%. Suddenly, over 3,000 extra second homes suddenly appeared in Southwark. But anyway, I'm just going to see if I can manage to share screen, which hopefully I will manage to do. Sharing screen. It's the bit where I'd now try. That's try screen. Yeah, excellent. Okay. Right. Okay. So one of the questions people always ask about empty homes is how many are there? When I say there are 1 million empty homes, I'm not suggesting that Paul's got his data wrong. I'm just counting some ones that he isn't counting. So you'll note Paul noted the total vacancy figure of around about 2/3 of a million. I would add into that selection of homes that people aren't living in. I would also say we should probably have a look at the second homes as well. The category of second homes in British data doesn't reflect their use as a second home or a holiday home. There are thousands of so-called second homes in Bradford, which I very much doubt are holiday homes. And a lot of them, we are told by local officers, are simply empty homes, sheltered from council tax premiums. And in fact, across the country, there's 263,000 of those. They're not all empty homes. Some of them are actively used for very short periods, but they're not your classic holiday home, because your classic holiday home is now often removed from the local tax system altogether by being counted for business rates. So, okay, we've got maybe 1 million of these homes that no one's living in. I suppose the other question that I think we need to ask is, why is the housing we're building not contributing to reducing homelessness? And at a very simplistic level, the answer is because we're building the wrong housing. Now, in this sense, I won't be saying anything very different to what a lot of other speakers are saying. We are building an absolutely microscopic amount of social homes, and we're largely shifting a huge number of people who 30 years ago would have been housed in social or reduced rent housing into private rented housing. And that private rented housing is obviously being provided by landlords. And the majority of it is being provided by small investor landlords. In other words, it's being provided by the 10% of our population that own more than one home, as opposed to the 40% of our population which own no home. So, I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down in what's going on with the specific feature of long-term empty homes, but it is interesting. They went up a lot last year, and as I say, the data did reveal some quite interesting things. Actually, sorry, I'm flicking my slides a bit fast there, but while it's true that the highest concentration of empty homes is in the northeast, the largest number is, because it's a large region, it's in the northwest, followed by the southeast. And the biggest increases for the last 4 years, not just fueled by the pandemic, have actually been in the southeast, London, the east of England, and the Midlands, which are actually areas of quite high, as we would perceive it, housing price, housing demand. They're also areas that we perceive to have quite high amounts of development. And that takes us on to the issue of what I would call high and low value residualisation. And this is where Rex's work kind of meets up with some of our work, because high value residualisation are homes that are bought to wash money or bought for capital appreciation. They're homes that aren't bought primarily to be lived in. It's also worth noting that the dominant development model, which is practiced in a lot of our cities, involves quite a significant amount of off-plan sales. Often those are off-plan sales to overseas investors, but not exclusively to overseas investors. And I think it's actually quite unhelpful to focus wholly on overseas investors, because some overseas investment, as Rex would tell you, is actually domestic investment coming through tax havens. So if you have a building model where, as I say, at least 20% of your development is sold off plan to investors in the first instance, you're probably building in a certain amount of vacancy to your building model. And I think that's quite significant with particularly some of the what you would call the investor tower developments you see in city centres like Manchester and London. You've probably got a different type of investment going on, of course, in some of these executive village extensions. You're perhaps more likely to see buy-to-let investment there and other forms of secondary home investment. But one of the things that's notable about the biggest rises in empty homes last year, and I'm cognizant of time here, is that for each one of what you would call the classic low value residualized places like Stoke-on-Trent or Liverpool or Rochdale, you'll also see really big rises in areas like Southwark and Brent and Newham, which are essentially quite high value parts of inner London. Also places experiencing extreme levels of housing need and high levels of development. So just to quickly sort of cut to the chase and say, what are the radical questions we should be asking ourselves? And in this sense, I may be inadvertently channeling some of the chat. How can we bring empty homes into use? How many could we return, and how quickly? Are they the wrong homes in the wrong places? I think that it's no longer easy enough to say they're the wrong homes in the wrong places, because there are empty homes everywhere, and the regions that previously had lower levels are now starting to accumulate higher levels of perhaps higher value empty homes, but still empty homes. So fundamentally, I would say that we have to question the building model. The question is, with all this, if you like, surplus or empty housing we have, what can we do with it? And the idea of redistributing some of this or reallocating it to social housing stock is now gaining what I would call more mainstream currency. It's no longer just the radical voices calling for the requisitioning of empty homes. There are conservative councils calling for stronger powers to bring empty homes into use, or to stand in place of landlords and force them back into the rental market. And the Affordable Housing Commission, led by Lord Best, also proposed essentially buying housing out of the bottom end of the private rental market, bringing it up to higher standard, and providing it as social or reduced rent housing. So there are another issue we looked at, particularly in our work in London, has been the influence of short-term lets and Airbnb. That's a significant part of the potential business model that's available to those investor homes, and some of those dark or well, Paul described them as towers where the lights are on and no one's at home. Sometimes the lights aren't on either, but when the lights are on, they're probably on because it's an Airbnb rather than because it's a house or a home. And yeah, London councils have estimated at least one home in 50 across the whole of London is being used solely for Airbnb, not for housing. That's a quite significant chunk of housing, possibly as many as 70,000 homes. And this is in the context of London currently having over 30,000 long-term vacant homes and over 53,000 second homes. And we can't assume, and we've had a good hard look at the data to test our assumptions on this, we can't assume that those second homes and Airbnbs are the same data set, because they simply aren't. There's no consistency of data across London boroughs. There's certainly a certain
Sorry, Chris, can I jump in there? I didn't mean to cut across your train of thought, but did you want to make a final sum up statement, or do you want to just stay in the meeting and respond to any questions people have?
I'll give you my final slide, which
brilliant.
Which doesn't sum up so much for the simple answer factors. There aren't any simple answers, and it does also echo Paul's argument that empty homes alone can't solve the housing crisis. I think the contribution they could make, if you broaden the definition of empty homes to include those second homes, would be quite significant, and that leads us into the area of how we plan and what planning restrictions we put on people's ability to have holiday lets and second homes in particular areas, and whether indeed we plan for specific types of housing for those types of use, rather than simply allowing homes to be sucked out of mainstream supply. One of our major significant, I think, points we would like to make on this is that currently we count stuff that is not used as residential supply as if it is residential supply. And that is a large part of the answer to the question, how do we keep building housing and increasing homelessness? It's not just that we're building the wrong housing, it's that some of it doesn't end up as housing.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. That was really interesting. And like I say, like with the other speakers, there's just so much in there. I feel bad you haven't got a meeting all to yourself. But I can see there's a lot of really good reactions in the chat as well. And I've got one more person that I've planned to bring in on the discussion before I open it up to other people to have your say. And I think one of the things that you had in yours, Chris, was the idea of, are we going beyond just simply demanding the houses that are empty and nobody's using to saying, well, should we be requisitioning houses that are being used in the wrong way? And one person who's always making very radical demands is Richard Lee from Just Space. So it's a good time to bring you in, Richard, and maybe give us some suggestions on what kind of demands you think we should be putting forward to deal with the housing crisis in the context of a climate emergency.
Hello, everyone. I'm not sure I'm going to be so more radical, but maybe a bit different though. So I'm here as both the coordinator of Just Space, which is a London-wide network of community groups focusing on planning issues in London, and I'm also a community activist in the London Borough of Southwark. In Just Space, we are producing something that we're calling a community-led recovery plan. And we've had a series of workshops on this. And I'd like to briefly share a few of the ideas that have come out of those workshops and which we feel are going to be central in the recovery plan that we're writing at the moment. I guess the starting point is that the housing crisis takes many different forms, and different forms for different groups within society. I think there needs to be a real shift of emphasis away from this overriding emphasis on new supply. And we need to have a lot more emphasis on the existing housing stock, because there's a crisis within the existing stock as well. The housing crisis shouldn't be just appropriated by the development industry. So an example of the crisis for the existing housing is around energy and fuel rights. And there has to be a radical decarbonisation programme for the existing housing stock. Probably most people here would agree that the best way to do that would be through a mass retrofit programme under public ownership with strong investment in a Green New Deal, so that we can skill the workforce to be able to deliver that mass retrofit. So I'm assuming that's probably taken as granted. But the issue I'd like to pose is around the transition to all of this. And obviously, in terms of the climate emergency, the language of doing it in a way that's a just transition is a very powerful argument. And this is linking together the social justice issues with issues of environmental justice. So to give a few examples, in terms of the decarbonisation of existing housing, there's going to be a need rapidly to phase out all of the gas boilers. Huge task, but needs to happen quickly. how's this going to be done in a way that's socially just? Who do we need to be focusing attention on? So clearly there's a lot of issues around those who are in the deepest fuel poverty, those who are on lower incomes, how to make heat pump replacement technology affordable, inverted commas, and also to maybe connect this up with what some of the earlier speakers have raised around how we must oppose demolition of existing housing. And I think we oppose demolition for a variety of reasons, which actually unite us in total. You know, we oppose it on the grounds of loss of community, the loss of our existing place that we live in and cherish. But also there's the very strong circular economy arguments, which aren't just about recycling. I mean, recycling is not the top priority. The top priority is to reuse and to repurpose. So I think there's a strong connection there in terms of what we probably all feel around why displacing communities is a terrible thing to do, but also linking this up to other issues around the climate emergency. Because we haven't got much time, I'll just mention one other thing, which has really come through loud and clear in a number of our workshops, and that's about the importance of racial justice and the importance of the intersection of race and class. In terms of what I was just covering, in terms of why we should be opposing demolition and displacement, this has a particularly strong impact on many Black communities in London. There's a recent report out by the Runnymede Trust that makes some interesting arguments on that. And I think it's important that we don't take this kind of colourblind approach, and that we actually recognise that there's an importance to look at this in a culturally aware way, in terms of, for example, the value of multi-generational living that's extremely important in a number of different Black and ethnic communities. And we also found, and this I just want to finish really by just raising the importance of the environment that we all live in. We can't look at housing in isolation. Our quality of life also depends on the immediate environment surrounding our home, and green space and nature is one important aspect of that. Again, there's been reports out recently by Friends of the Earth asking the question, well, who is most deprived in terms of access to green space and nature? And the highest deprived group in London is Black communities, and there's also very strong deprivation on class terms. So I think that, I hope that we would be able to integrate these arguments and give visibility to these arguments in whatever we come up with. So my final comment would be that I don't see that we have to have any clash here between housing crisis versus environmental or ecological crisis. Actually, there is a crisis which expresses itself in a number of different ways, and the social justice aspect of this is just as important as the environmental justice aspect. So let's look at how we can interconnect these issues and intersect these issues, and I think then we would have a more radical manifesto.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. That was brilliant, and bringing in again more new ideas and different perspectives on this massive issue that we're trying to cover here tonight. So that is the last person that I had planned to bring in to make a contribution, which means I can take people just who are here who want to comment on anything that's been said, bring your own knowledge and ideas to this discussion. If you just raise your hand, I'll call you. I see Diane has written in the chat again. Diane, did you want to speak, or did you just happy to write in the chat? It's fine either way. If anybody wants to, I can see the chat is just dinging. People are posting in there, which is great. But if anybody wants to speak, if you could raise your hand. Oh, sorry, Suresi. Do you want? I'm just going to unmute.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, you're
Can
on.
you hear me?
Yeah,
Hello?
go ahead.
Okay, good, thanks. Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that, well, I think the major disagreement that's taking place in the chat is people agreeing or disagreeing with the idea of the need to build more housing in London. I think that's quite a contentious issue in the chat. What I would say personally as a civil engineer would be that I disagree that building a house is inherently harmful to the environment. I think it depends on the materials that you use. So if you use obviously concrete, you will be polluting, but there are innovative technologies and there are natural materials that you can build with, like straw bale, like timber. So the technologies are there, and they're not necessarily more expensive than current methods.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks, Suresi. That was, I think that's quite an important argument, because I was, as I say, I started the whole meeting on the presumption that, oh, sorry, has somebody frozen? Oh, Suresi, sorry, had you finished speaking? I think the screen froze. It did for me anyway.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. As I say,
I think you froze.
Oh, it was me that froze. Okay, sorry. Everybody was frozen on my screen. Thank you. I like to say that's actually thrown a huge spanner in the works of some of the debate we're having, because as I say, I started with the presumption that building is an environment, is a challenge to the environment. So it'd be really interesting to hear other people's comments on that. Bill, did you have your hand up? Do you want to come in? Bill? Okay.
Oh, sorry, you were breaking up a bit. There was an interesting, local newspapers around the country have been doing this interesting thing, which is the climate flooding map. And so all along the south coast, I think it's by 2050, Rise underwater, Eastbourne, and local papers are beginning to do that around the country now. And I always think with these things, you know, most of us started in housing and then they get involved in the climate movement. But the reality of the climate movement is so stark, and the debate up to now has been, in a sense, what do we do with the homes? How do we get more social housing? How do we get the homeless into homes? And we've not worried. So it's been, of the homes that are built, can we ensure that enough? Can we save our social housing? But now the question, I really think, becomes about the use of land and what land, and even the question of, I thought what Richard said at the end there, of climate solidarity, that in the climate crisis to come, it's not like let these people drown, we're all right on the top of our hill. And so and the response of the government and the declaration of a climate emergency is now let the developers run rip. So across the country, not just in London now, bits of land are being turned over to the developers at a rate of knots. And so in a sense, it's like the market, which has failed to deliver on the housing crisis, is now actually going to contribute more to the climate crisis. And every development is bullshit, because they talk about net zero over 50 years. And for a start, we have to see that every development that they're building is going to produce CO2 at the minute, because there might be the new technologies and the new materials, but the predominant developments are not going to use them. They're going to use concrete, and they're looking at net zero for those projects over 50 years. They're looking at that. And so my instinct on this is we have to say stop to new developments. Just because it's like they're unleashing crazy, we're in the middle of crazy. And so it's like any new development has to be done. Has everything else been thought of first? So there's a new campaign being unleashed, insulate every home. Well, maybe who has to pay for that is a way that we can get the rich companies to let go of some of their property. insisting on environmental standards, new building standards, bringing real public democracy over what's built. And so we look at what we're building and how we're using homes in the context of a genuine climate crisis that is hitting us now. And I just feel that we have to, I thought what Richard said was brilliant. I don't think there is a contradiction. I think in dealing with the climate crisis, we can actually find the solutions to the housing crisis. It's about how we use the finite resources we have in a situation where we're facing, catastrophe. And so, to me, is we have to think of the demands we raise. And I thought some of what people have said are brilliant to make that happen. And part of that has to be wresting control away from the developers into proper democratic, use of land. I'm going on too long as usual.
No, thanks, Bill. You threw a lot of new issues again as well in there, which is great. I hope people will respond. There's 3 people with their hands up, which is great. Okay, Bonnie, do you want to come in next?
Yes, so following on from Richard, with my people's land policy hat on, that's exactly the issue I was going to raise, is you have to have a holistic view of how land is used. I mean, in the UK as a whole and within London. This is why Just Space and their approach to have, looking at a community-led plan and looking at the whole picture, all the different potential uses of land. And we need to have a clear picture of what we need. And it's already been said, we need to have some land that's set aside as wild places. We need for biodiversity. We need to have land set aside as green spaces. We also need to have land set aside for things like growing fruit and veg. There's all sorts of uses of land in addition to housing. And we need to have a picture of this, and it has to be developed by all of us. And at the moment, that overall picture of how we should use our land is not being developed by all of us. It's being developed by a few people for profit. I mean, that is the essential issue. So again, I agree with people that say it doesn't have to be polarized between build houses or not build houses. But really, when you look around and so much is being built, and as people said, it's not being used for what it should be used, the only solution seems to be is to target the financialization of land and the fact that people are buying up all these things in order to speculate, in order to, as an investment. All that has to stop. This is a united campaign that would benefit both the environment, people who are interested in food growing, and people that are interested in housing. So I would like to see more and more different people from different land uses that they're interested in. It could also be the food growing sector in London as well, coming together to say, well, how can we integrate and have a really good perspective of how we want land to be used in London that can deal with the housing crisis and can deal with the food crisis, for that matter, and also the environmental crisis.
Thanks, Bonnie. That was a big big vision you put there. It threw me back to thinking about my Irish history and the Land League, and when we got a hold of all that British landlord land in Ireland for growing food, and you think about the radical kind of challenge to ownership and control that we kind of need in what you're talking about there. Who's Ben Clay? Do you want to come in?
Thanks. I think other people have their hand up before me.
No, I think it was you and then Pete and Doug. Oh, and okay. Diane.
Okay.
Sorry.
No probs. So I'm here with, well, as an interest as a housing activist. I'm also involved in the Labour campaign for council housing. One of the things that I've spent a bit of time talking to people about is the lack of skills. So let's just assume that there was a government willing to pay for mass retrofitting of all the buildings that we need to retrofit to deal with the climate crisis. We don't have the skills. We don't have sufficient people trained with the skills. We don't even have sufficient people trained to train people for the skills. And so there's a huge challenge, but also it's an opportunity because obviously there's loads of potentially well-paid, skilled jobs which will keep people you know, with a decent standard of living for many, many years to come, dealing with, you know, hundreds of thousands of homes that need to be insulated, need to have, you know, renewable energy sources fitted, and lots of other things that need to happen if we're going to get anywhere near carbon neutrality for lots of the old buildings. And I say this as someone who's read this somewhere, but my understanding in terms of demolitions is that we should avoid demolishing if at all possible, because that's like a huge carbon store which is then just being released straight back into the environment. So, you know, even though you might replace it with a very energy efficient, you know, fancy new building that's performs much better and stuff like that, you've already released so much carbon into the atmosphere by doing that, you know, you've made a huge dent in any potential savings. So yeah, interested in that. And I've seen some of the stuff about alternative materials for construction. I'm glad to see those links there. But in terms of high density housing developments, I'm just wondering if anyone who's involved in that can let us know if that's something that there's any schemes out there where people have used alternate materials that are more environmentally friendly to build tall buildings, high density buildings, and, you know, in terms of fire safety implications and stuff like that. If there's any more information on that, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. I think you threw in fire safety as well. Every word people use is another massive issue getting thrown into the mix. Sorry, did I get mixed up? Doug, did you have your hand up before Pete? I'm really confused now. I'm not hearing this very well. Sorry. Doug, do you want to go ahead? Sorry.
Yeah, I just think there's been an awful lot coming out of this, and we need to capture it, because I think there's more agreement than there is disagreement here. And I think, you know, I think it needs to be a halt on market-led development. That we shouldn't be demolishing places. We should be refurbishing them, and we should be looking at acquiring properties that can be brought into use because they're empty or because they're being used, particularly in large towns, for things like Airbnb. There might be an exception for Airbnb in, say, Cornish villages which depend on it for you know, the whole economy of the village is based on the tourism that brings in. But certainly in towns like London, Manchester, whatever, things like Airbnb and so on, and retrofitting. My only doubt is that I think we need to get accurate information as well, because we can't rely on things like local authority housing lists. Most people who need housing don't register anymore because, you know, actually a lot can't. The way that the housing allocation systems have been restructured, it's very clear to an awful lot of people who look at the council's website that they will have no hope. There are people sharing beds, let alone bedrooms, in London, who are not even approaching councils because they're precarious in terms of their immigration status and so on. So what we need, some way of getting accurate information. And also looking at land use, because I agree with Bonnie. The one area of land use that I do have question about when I walk around London is the vast amounts of land that seem to be occupied by private golf courses. And I can't see any justification for that as a use of land. So I think bringing these things together and getting accurate information, I think it may well reduce the sort of assumptions we've had in the past about the amount of building that needs to be done to build new social housing as opposed to repurposing. But I'm yet to be convinced by any of the figures that there is going to be absolutely no need for new council housing, particularly taking into account the needs for accommodation suitable for the disabled, for different types of households and so on. So I just think I wouldn't want to have a plan that ruled out absolutely the possibility of any new development. And clearly we need to look at the technologies that reduce the carbon element of any such construction, and perhaps avoiding concrete and so on. I think we can probably, you know, with a bit more work, we can get to something that at least most of us would agree on here.
Thanks, Doug. Pete.
Yeah, thank you, Grace, and great to hear so many wise voices on this subject, as always. So yeah, I'm Pete Elliott and I'm Gypsy Hill Ward Councillor for the Green Party, and I live on the Central Hill estate with Sabine. And you know, I think there's three main aspects that I'm really concerned about with the housing crisis and the environmental crisis, and that's those two things, along with this injustice, social injustice that we get created by these two aspects of the climate and housing crisis. And they're being used at the moment because we don't have a clear strategy to address either of these. It means that people who can least of all fight for themselves and stick up for themselves are really, really suffering. And we see this in spades on the Central Hill estate, where we've had a load of people. I mean, since 2017, when they declared that the estate was going to get demolished, we've had hundreds of people moved out of the estate. Many of the houses are still sat empty, and we've had many of the houses, due to the fact that the pressure that we've put on, is they've filled them back up, but with people in temporary accommodation, some of whom are in temporary accommodation for 14 years. But these people are, you know, they do not have any security there, and the kids are really suffering, and the community's suffering because we've had such a high turnover of people. One of the things that we have done and we've got coming up, which I'd really like to flag and use this opportunity just to flag to you, is that we have put a motion forward to the full council meeting of Lambeth on the 21st of July, and it's looking at temporary accommodation, and it's all about trying to give people in temporary accommodation equal rights, and those people that have been shipped into places like Central Hill, Cressingham Gardens and others, is to give them secure tenancies on these estates. These estates are not going anywhere for the next 5 years. So we're asking that the council actually gives these people some security of tenure while they can. And, you know, and so I'd really ask your support on that. And just picking up, I mean, there's been so many great comments today, and I just really, you know, the whole retrofitting and creating an industry out of retrofitting the housing stock that we have across the country is a massive opportunity, you know, for jobs creation, the economy, and we've really got to push our politicians to do much more on this front, and make them understand why it is really, really important. It is not you demolish homes and you build new homes that aren't to the right standards. It is just so destructive. You know, you're destroying somewhere. You know, even if you're building a new home with bricks and mortar, you've destroyed somewhere else to create those bricks and mortars. So, you know, we have to stop using that. We have to build back sustainably. And also by retrofitting, you're then pulling people out of fuel poverty as well. So, you know, there's so many good reasons to do that. And I could go on forever. So I'll stop.
I know, Pete, I'm sorry. You obviously have loads of things you could share with us. I mean, what you're doing in Lambeth is brilliant. It's brilliant work, and it's so frustrating to see you being attacked by a Labour council saying that you don't care about housing. And that's one of the biggest problems we have, is people talk up for the environment and they're accused of not caring about homeless people, and it's so cynical. Rex, do you want to come in? Sorry, Rex.
Yeah, I just have a small comment to make. Part of the problem in what's happened over the last 40 years is that, you know, 40 years ago, houses were use values. You lived in the house. It was where your family came together, and, you know, you utilized the house. What's happened over the last 40 years or so is houses have switched from being a use value to an exchange value. So now houses are primarily exchange values, and that has a whole chain of connections in finance, in property developers, etc., etc. So one of the things I think we have to do is try to insist, if you like, on use value as opposed to exchange value. The second thing I'd like to mention just briefly is that, you know, the local councils, I think they're in I've seen where property developers just roll over local currencies, local councils, where the councils really need money that the government through austerity has withdrawn. So it leaves local councils very, very vulnerable, and it leads them to compromise on with big money coming from developers, coming from wherever. And then the last thing I'd like to, so that I think that's an important element. I think somehow we have to address the local councils. Lastly, you know, in terms of, I'm an economist, so I'm thinking about policy, and I'm thinking about policy in the area that I'm operating in. And wealth taxes have been heavily promoted. But I'd like to put it out there that we could possibly look at land taxes, which I really think offer we could cut to the chase, I think, with land taxes. So that's my contribution right now. Thank you.
No, thank you, Rex. And it's really good to hear, like, the last few contributions have all had like kind of practical proposals for demands that we can put to kind of move this campaign forward. So I'll come back to that in a bit, but that's really useful if other people want to propose specific demands they think we should be raising. Diane, sorry, I didn't see you at first, and I'm sorry you've been waiting. Go ahead.
Perfectly okay. In fact, it's interesting because each person that has spoken has kind of added an extra facet to the picture. That therefore, I'll start at the end. Rex's thing that the councils are all vulnerable because of austerity and all that lot. It's true, and we can appeal to them on the level of. If I go to the beginning. Richard Lee, and we need to all work together. Yes, if we can all work together and join all the ideas together and put forward some kind of manifesto, I think was the word he used, that it contains 10 points or something like that, that actually covers not just the housing, but the retrofitting and the greening and the environment, and all those things together, because all those things that have been mentioned all come into the same plan and they all link together. The government hasn't actually got an alternative. The reason they keep carrying on with their bread is buttered nicely, so we'll keep doing it and give the developers the money and the power. But if we came up with a really brilliant plan, we could actually take that power away from them by saying, look, this is what you could do instead. And maybe not all of them, because some of them are, like Georgina says, conservative Tory, who are doing really nicely. But lots of them would actually change their mind if some of them are genuinely want to do something to help the situation. So if you just got through to half of them, you get a tipping point of how many people would do this alternative plan. It just means coming up with a good plan and we can all work together. And I'll stop talking there.
No, Diane, you are spot on, because that is exactly what we're hoping to do. I explained at the beginning of the meeting, but I'm just going to explain it again a bit more now, actually, and I'm going to post it in the chat. So the Radical Housing Network, we had started this discussion with ourselves and a few other people about how to launch a charter of demands, very simple but key demands that could be supported by environmental activists and housing campaigners together, and that we could use both to lobby politicians to kind of create a debate and bring people over onto our side, but also as a kind of a framework for joint action. So to kind of justify actions on empty homes, we link it to a broader kind of agenda of how this whole issue could be solved together. See what I mean? So that's what we did, and this workshop came out of the process of developing that charter, because we hit a stumbling block when we said don't build houses, and other people said we need to build houses, and we need to work with, this is the idea of this workshop, is to kind of trash that out a little bit and get the right nuance, if that makes sense, that everybody feels confident fighting for. So I'm going to try and share the charter, and then and as I say, if people raise more demands, it would be really good at the end of this meeting if people could volunteer to work together to build on the charter, to adapt, to add key issues to sort of work on, and then we could launch it as a bigger initiative further down the line. So I'll throw that out there for people to think about. I'll post it in the chat, and I'm going to call Paul Burnham to speak while I'm doing that.
Oh, hello, everybody. It's Paul Burnham here from Defend Council Housing. The first thing is, I think what we've got at the moment is a house building industry which is increasingly disconnected from human need. It always used to be disconnected to a large extent. It's increasingly become completely disconnected. It doesn't bear any relation to what people actually need. And it's frightening to see the capture of planning policy by property developer interest. These are things we need to change. The development of super dense neighbourhoods again is horrifying. We've seen them on the drawing board, and now we're increasingly seeing them in real life in London. That's horrifying. We need to stop that. We're seeing the neglect of children and families again, which is something we need to prevent that from happening. And what's central to this, really, to my mind, is the overproduction of unaffordable homes. So because we have affordable housing targets, 40%, this means that 60% of housing built is totally unaffordable. When they miss their affordable housing target, we can see what we're actually getting. Now, I do believe that the provision of council housing at council rents with secure tenancies has to be central to any strategy that's been put forward by the Shelter report the year before last, taken up by the Labour Party in the last general election. Even a select committee of the House of Commons dominated by Conservative MPs said that we need mass social rent programme. That's what's needed, not just bits and pieces, but a mass programme. Now, that I think building has got to be central to that, but it's quite, the critics of building are of course right. You don't just build houses, you could take over houses as well. So that's what, you could convert the existing stock to more to human needs rather than building new, or as well as building new council homes. And I just finally say that the current planning proposals, it's great to see the government climbing down. Now the latest statement from Genric is this: they were going to it's going to be transformative. They're going to rip up the housing policy completely. They're now saying they're not going to do that. But it's really important that they don't go ahead with their key proposals, which free developers from their obligations to provide affordable housing, and on any other planning issues that will continue. Planning will continue to be, we've certainly used it where I live, as a major struggle where we do actually hold the developers to planning policies, because they put forward policies, they put forward developments, and it's simply a load of lies. You can go through it, and at the moment there's a forum. The planning system provides a forum to put in objections and to go along and object in person. That's really important that we keep all those things in the planning system in the future. Thank you.
You're muted.
Sorry. Okay, I was just saying that I'm going to call Portia next, even though she was not the first person with her hand up, because she hasn't spoken yet. So the other people with their hands up have already spoken. So if anybody else who hasn't spoken wants to speak, you'll jump to the head of the queue, and then I'll get to the people who've spoken already. Okay, so Portia,
thank you very much.
Speak?
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really interesting, and particularly I think that what Rex said about, I'm sure we all support wholeheartedly Rex's call for a land value tax, but there was an earlier reference, and this is what I actually wanted to say, to the Runnymede and class analysis and push to the margins. But number 3 of their 5 recommendations is actually quite, well, it's woolly. It talks about social housing, which of course is generally delivered by housing associations at the moment, and they're not a good idea. And also community land trusts, which are very much flavour of the month, but it does need further examination, because they are, if you look at that model, it is actually tomorrow's housing associations, and the same problems that we see today with housing associations will come to pass with CLTs in 30 years' time. And it is that thing of separating the land from the housing on it, which has always left everybody in the housing without control of the land. It's another land struggle, and that's kind of embedding land struggles in a very fashionable way. And it's not one. I would urge everybody to look more closely at the CLT model before upholding it as the way forward, because there are inherent disadvantages to it. So that's my big comment. Sorry, you're mute again. You're on mute.
I'm really sorry. I think okay, I just have one hand up at the moment. Other people who had their hand up have gone down. So I'll call Ben back in, and then if anyone else wants to come in, please do. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention, because people touched on the economics of development stuff. So because of the deregulation of mortgage financing in the 80s, you know, there's a good book on this called The Economics of Land and Housing, written by, I think, New Economics Foundation people. Basically, for financial services industry and banks in this country, property speculation and land value speculation is a better earner than investing in the productive economy. So actually, there's good capitalist arguments to see that as being not helpful for our economy as a whole. But basically, as long as that is allowed, so long as we have deregulated mortgage finance and financial services industry regarding throwing money into land and property as being a pretty safe return in our economy, then we're not going to stop the problems that we've got around it. And that's a huge vested interest to take on. So I think we need to, like we say, have a land value tax. We also need to have mechanisms for councils, the government to compulsory purchase land at existing use value for development of council homes or social rent homes, and that's got to be part of the problem. On the environmental side, I'm wondering if anyone has got alternatives to the mass building of council homes or social homes. Because I don't, you know, unless we can have mass requisitions of empty homes, I don't think the homes are actually there for the housing need, and also the changes of people's household sizes and things like that, which has led to more small households in this country over the last few years as well.
Thanks, Ben. One of the people we had asked to come and speak, who's done some work on that kind of issue of how is there enough for everybody, was Danny Dorling, and I'd recommend his book to anybody. A lot of the statistics, I did speak to him by email about this meeting. He's just sick of Zoom meetings apparently, but he said the statistics in his books are still very current. And one of the things that stood out for me when I read it was he said there is enough bedrooms in this country for every family to have one bedroom for each member of the family plus a spare room, and with existing stock. So that's a massive issue about where the fair distribution of housing. But even in terms of the idea that everyone should have a spare room for visitors or for whatever, even that is would be covered by a fair and equitable distribution of all the bedrooms currently in this country at the moment. So interesting statistic. Lynn Ainan, you have your hand up and you haven't spoken, so I'm going to call you next. You need to unmute, Lynn.
My apologies, I keep doing this. Right, hi everybody. I'm not from London, I'm from Cardiff, but I saw the invitation to this call and I thought I'd come and learn from it, because we're currently in the process of replacing the existing local development plan for our city. So of course, all these issues that have come up today are very pertinent, very relevant to that. So Cardiff has certainly had a model that says demolish and rebuild or build on greenfield sites is the way to go. And we want to challenge that in quite a big way and say that, you know, that those should be the last options, that other options such as empty homes, such as conversions and so on should be looked at first. A couple of points of interest. If right to buy just came up in the chat, that is something Welsh Government has abolished. We haven't moved very far yet on planning policy from the English norm, if you like, but Abolishing right to buy was one thing that has done. It has enabled some councils to restart council house building programs, not on the scale I would like, but they have restarted it. So in terms of organising campaigning on this, yes, we are trying to link up environmental and housing sort of civic society type organisations. And in fact, Extinction Rebellion have suggested, and other organisations have come in on it, we're going to hold an open air People's Assembly to discuss the local development plan later this week, which would be quite interesting, and I'm sure a lot of these issues will come up. A couple of things that haven't yet been mentioned that are of more general significance, I think. The question of land has come up and the value of land. That's obviously very important. Getting planning permission to convert agricultural land to residential land can increase its value 100-fold. Right? There's big money to be made in this. The building market itself is very dominated by big companies. 4 corporations account for 1/3 of all the houses being built in the UK at the moment. So there is a lot of power that has to be challenged, because they do put immense pressure on local councils who has been pointed out of austerity starved and are looking for money from anywhere they can get it. So I just wanted to sort of say a few things, that this isn't just a London issue. It's something which is occurring in different forms across the country, and yes, we need to link up, and that's it's been very interesting. I'm glad I was able to join you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Definitely, we want to reach out. We just started where we were at in London, but as you say, this is definitely a national issue, and I hope we can build on the links in this meeting and make more, hopefully. Sarah, you're part of a national organisation. Do you want to come in next?
Thank you. Yeah, I actually just what Lynn said there about more general points. Well, 2 things. I'm going to have to dial off the call in a minute because I have some but also I think I wanted to touch on a couple of more general points, and I feel certainly that some of the things that we also must do, and it's maybe not for the Radical Housing Network's Charter of Demands to do, but just generally in our capacity of organisations who have the ears of significant numbers of people, is that we do desperately need a shift in our value system. It's fundamentally focusing, like a lot of what we see in a lot of the environments that we interact in are very much focused on a sort of an individual consumerist approach to all things, and that is something that really needs to be attacked, like at its very, very basis, or maybe attacked is not the right language to be using, but certainly to be challenged. I also think that this kind of really does that speak for everybody about the recording thing, or just me? So I think it was just wanted to sort of touch on those things as well, because I think we can get very, very involved in the specifics and trying to get those changes through, but we also need the population to be behind those decisions, so that the policymakers who are pushing those decisions in front of them when it comes to the day that we're all at the polls, that people know what that means, that they know what that means to their everyday lives, and that they know that this is crucial, and it needs to happen now, because like a lot of people have said, we are running out of time. But that was a really general point and not necessarily in response to something that anybody else said. But
thank you so much, Sarah. I think that encapsulated a lot of what people were saying about like stopping commercialization of everything and use value rather than exchange value for homes. You put in the chat that you wanted to know if we could have a shared document for the charter, and definitely, I know you have to leave now, so does that make sense? Would everybody here like to be sent a link to the Google Doc for this charter and have an input, or is it just a few people want to be involved? Could you stick your hand up if you'd be interested in getting sent the charter as a link so you could feed back directly on your ideas? Okay, there's enough hands up that we'll just go with that then, rather than taking volunteers. So hopefully we'll be working together again soon then, Sarah. Thank you so much for coming this evening. It was really good to hear your input.
Is it possible to have the slides as well, please? Is that okay?
I can share my slides with Grace, and then hopefully Grace can share it to everybody who's been here today. And equally, I'd love to get slides of other speakers. There's lots of really great information there. So thank you.
Yeah,
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. I did ask the other speakers, I think some other people were able to share their slides as well, and I made them rush through so much facts and figures, and I'm sure we'd all like to get a chance to go back and look at them in detail. Sarah's had to leave to put a child to bed, which is a very legitimate reason to get off of a Zoom call at 8:30 in the evening. I don't have a child to get to bed, but I'm just wondering how people feel. I don't want people to have to leave in dribs and drabs. Do people want to continue the discussion for a bit longer? Or do most people want to finish here? If you put your hand up if you'd like to continue. Okay, I think most people feel, do people feel like we've got a real sense of a lot of the issues? Shall I try and round it up in the next just few minutes or next 5 minutes or so? Is that okay? Because as I say, I don't want people to just leave because they've got things to do. I'd rather us all leave in one go. There's just been so much different information. Hopefully we can, the notes will grab a lot of that and the slides from the speakers, which we can share afterwards. Okay, I've got Martha who hasn't spoken yet. Is there anyone else who hasn't spoken who'd like to kind of have a last say?
Grace, Paul's had his real hand up for quite a long time on and off. I think he wants to speak as well.
Which
Paul?
Yeah, look, you know.
Sorry, Paul.
No worries. No, it's just a point about Danny Dorling's, point about the bedrooms. And, I'm not saying anything that I haven't already said to him because I discussed this. It's a very interesting statistic, and certainly, but what is the political, I don't understand what the political basis for that is. Yes, you can do some sort of like nudging around the council tax, but this isn't 1917 in St. Petersburg. There aren't armed Soviets going to go into rich people's homes and, requisition their bedrooms. I mean, I don't see what the politics of that is at all. I really don't. It just seems to me one of those factoids, which is fascinating, but I don't see where it gets you.
Okay, I think that's quite a strong challenge to the idea of sharing out the existing housing, and maybe it's a debate we're not going to solve here tonight. I guess my only reaction to it, Paul, would be that we saw in the pandemic what kind of radical reorganization of society was possible very, very quickly when there was clearly a kind of socially understood need to do things differently very quickly. And hopefully we might not have Soviets, Paul, or people but hopefully we're going to get to a point where, like Sarah was saying, there's going to be enough public understanding of this severe emergency that we are facing in terms of the climate crisis, that new radical policies will become more what people are willing to accept and understand is necessary. So, but yeah, that's the debate we have to have, isn't it? What are the demands that we can put that will be acceptable, that we can win, and that will make a difference? Martha, do you want to have the last word?
Well, thank you very much. I'm probably the wrong person for the last word, but if I could just say, I've tried to take notes on the speakers predominantly, but many of you made some 4 or 5 key suggestions, some of which you came back and reshaped slightly later or in other terms in the course of the conversation. It would be really helpful if those speakers particularly are those who were representing organizations would give us just in bullet points your 5 key actions or 2 key actions or whatever you suggested today. Some of you had 2, some had 3. Sarah had, I think, 4, but I would really be grateful to see that come through if you would be willing to share that, because we could then do a little bit of adjusting, maybe of some of the wording in the charter before we drop it onto the Google Doc for everybody to start feeding in, because there might be some slightly better language than the grassroots people were using at the beginning that you've suggested today. So that would be great. And then the second thing, just to thank everybody, particularly for the data you've brought today, which seems to me to be very, very necessary. It was pointed out by many of you. There are some things like buy-to-let that have come up. Regulations for buy-to-let money were changed very recently. The government changed them, allowing buy-to-let money only to be predominantly used for new builds, not for refurbs on existing building. There's a cap that's been dropped in. These things are happening behind the scenes. And this is what I think we're talking about when we are talking about developer-led planning policies, and they're being embraced by both major parties, maybe some other parties as well, without realizing it. And these are the sorts of things that we need to be able to stand up against in many small ways in the kinds of regulations that we're asking for. So that's just a kind of short comment in relationship to what Paul was saying. Obviously not a full one, but there are quite a few things that can be addressed with the spirit. But first we need to see what we can all agree on that we're prepared to begin to address. And then we can start drilling down on the regulations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martha. I have got one last. Pete, do you still have your hand up for now or from before? Because otherwise I can. Oh, you did. Oh, you didn't have your hand up. Sorry, Pete. It was up from before.
I did have my hand up, but
okay.
we've moved on, I think.
Okay. Well, look, I just want to say thank you to everybody who participated. I think hopefully everybody has got something out of the meeting in terms of a new angle or perspective or an element to this crisis that we hadn't thought about before, and that we can bring that together in the charter, but most importantly, bring it together in terms of willingness to fight, to stand up together, to campaign together, and to put these issues out to the wider public and explain that there are solutions to the housing crisis, there are solutions to the climate crisis, but we need politicians to get on board with those solutions and stop, selling us a pup about that they're going to sort it by 2050. So I think we all have a sense of urgency about all these issues, and I'm hoping we can send out an email, get some feedback, put something together that people feel confident with, and then maybe we'll go for like a launch meeting, a big event, or maybe some campaign protest actions. Be really good to get people's feedback on that as well. So I'm really looking forward to working with you all, and I'm going to sign off here. Thank you, everyone, for taking part.
Thank you. Thanks, Grace.
Thank you very much, Grace, for organizing for us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try and save the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
How do I do this?
Should be able to just copy the chat, by the way. You can just copy and paste it.
Can I do that? Because it's.
Yeah, it works. It works. I've done it before.
I am so illiterate. A year and a half of Zoom, and I still.
Yeah, but
save chat.
that's a safe way of doing it.
I've got save chat. Brilliant.
You've done that, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for all. Can you send me your slides?
I'm literally doing it as we speak.
Oh, fantastic! Brilliant. And yeah, I think most people have signed off now, but yeah, hopefully we can give. I mean, what do you think of the charter thing? You up for? Do you think Action on Empty Homes will get behind something like that, or is it something you
really interested to see whether we could. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people interested. Yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully. Okay, well, we'll be in touch by email and stuff anyway.
We've already been talking to ACAN about this. So
yeah.
There's a lot of people we know in this room, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe we're I don't know, teaching grandmothers to suck eggs, but I think there was a lot of there was people here who hadn't been part of that discussion before, I think, and who enjoyed it. And I know there was like at least 30 more people who had signed up who didn't come tonight. Now, whether that's just hangover from the English, from the football, or there's also a big meeting tonight, this clashes with, of the Insulate Britain, which I think the Extinction Rebellion people have probably gone to that. Unfortunately, we didn't know it was going to clash.
But you could send them a chat round, not the chat, sorry, the actual recording.
Yeah, no, but like, definitely there's people from Extinction Rebellion and other kind of activist environmental groups who were planning to come, who are registered but are not here, and I think that's like where we've clashed. But I think that we can build that afterwards and get them involved on kind of the building the charter. So hopefully. But anyway, I'll let you go. Thank you so much for coming. Bye, Diane.
Bye, bye. Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye, Georgina.
Bye, Georgina. And Franklin, whoever you are, can't see you. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.